Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on executing, monitoring, and controlling risk. This lesson covers the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of the remaining two risk management processes: implement risk responses and monitor risks, and explains how they interact with one another and how they use the information from the planning processes. In this table, you see all of the risk management processes, the planning processes, which we've already covered, including plan risk management, identify risks, perform qualitative risk analysis, perform quantitative risk analysis, and plan risk responses. As you can see, most of the processes in risk management are in the planning process group. Now for the executing and monitoring and controlling process groups, we have only two processes, one in each group. Implement risk responses, which implements those that were planned in the last one in the plan risk responses process. And then monitor risks in the monitoring and controlling process group. As we saw with the planning process group in risk management, many of the processes don't have any new project management artifacts that are generated as outputs. In this case, in executing, monitoring, and controlling risk, the implement risk responses process has no real new output. It updates some things, but doesn't really have a new artifact as an output. And for monitor risks, it's a very similar situation, but it does generate work performance information. Up to this point, you've identified risks and analyzed them and planned risk responses in the plan risk responses process, which is the last step of risk planning. And now it's time to implement those risk responses using this process, which is conveniently named Implement Risk Responses. This process is responsible for implementing the risk responses for overall project risk, as well as for all of the risk responses for individual risks, also known as negative risks, and for individual opportunities, known as positive risks. Remember that in the PMBOK guide, both risks and opportunities are managed together, because even though they're very different in the sense that you don't normally think of opportunities as risks, the way you manage opportunities to maximize them is very similar to how you manage risks to minimize negative risks. And so they're managed together. And this implement risk responses process implements both negative and positive risk responses. So it's about managing risk as well as trying to take advantage of and maximize your opportunities. One of the most common problems that we see in risk management is that even if you go through all this effort to analyze risk and plan responses, those risk responses may not be properly implemented. And so that's what this process is all about. Some key things to consider as you implement risk responses is to make sure that all of your risks have risk owners assigned, that those risk owners are responsible, and that you, as the project manager, proactively manage these risks in cooperation with the risk owners. So in order to implement risks, what are the inputs that you need? First and foremost, you have the risk register, which includes all of the risk responses that have been agreed to and the risk owners that have been assigned to each of these risks. In your planning processes, when you were doing all of this analysis, the qualitative and quantitative risk analysis, all of the results of that analysis aren't stored in separate artifacts, but in the risk register. So this is where all this information is about the risks. So of course, it's the first and primary item on the list as an input for implement risk responses. But you're also responsible for implementing the agreed risk response strategy for your overall project risk, which comes from your risk report. This risk report also will include highlights and categorization and analysis and trending of individual project risks that are considered high priority, as well as perhaps all of the significant risks analyzed in the aggregate, taking a look at how many different types of risks are in different categories and so on. Then, of course, you have your risk management plan, because that has all of the agreed rules and guidelines for how you will manage risk, including how you'll implement risk responses. The Lessons Learned Register is here because if you've learned any lessons earlier on in this project, you'll want to consider those as you implement risk responses later in the project. And speaking of lessons learned, your organizational process assets include your lessons learned repository, which will have information from previous projects about the effectiveness of different approaches to implementing risk responses and what worked and what didn't work, which may give you some guidance and insights on how to implement risk responses on your project. And now we move on to the tools and techniques for implement risk responses. First on the list is expert judgment. If you have any experts in your organization or in your industry that you can get a hold of that are experts in implementing and reviewing your risk responses, not only reviewing your plans for them, but also reviewing how well they've been implemented, then please consult with these types of experts. You'll need interpersonal and team skills, particularly influencing your risk owners. It can be a real challenge to get risk owners who are busy with their everyday issues and their day jobs, things that are pressing on their to-do list and their schedule, things that are urgent that have to be taken care of right away. People like this are very busy, and it's hard for them to keep up on risk management activities because those are involved with risks that may or may not happen. When you assign a risk owner, you need to make sure you pick someone who takes risks seriously, because we all have a tendency to ignore risks and hope that they don't happen rather than dealing with them head on. Or people just get too busy with the real work of the day to spend time on things that may or may not occur. So you need to be careful with who you pick as a risk owner and keep an eye on how well each of these risk owners is actually taking care of their risk management responsibilities. Some people consider risk responses to be a waste of time and money. An example is a disaster recovery plan. I've worked for organizations that have been very resistant to coming up with disaster recovery plans for their critical systems, simply because they haven't had a major outage in their critical systems for the last 5 or 10 years, and they haven't had any kind of a disaster happen, so they're not as open to the idea that they should plan for and be prepared for earthquakes or floods or things like that that can affect their data center and bring their systems down for days or weeks at a time, which could threaten the very survival of their business. But because it hasn't happened before, they keep putting it off and thinking they can wait, and it doesn't happen year after year. Because it's so difficult to get people to really take risks seriously, this is why we have a more structured approach to identifying risks, to performing qualitative risk analysis, quantitative risk analysis, in order to highlight the actual risks and make them more real. And then we can plan risk responses. The bottom line is that you need to follow up with your risk owners and make sure that they're taking care of their responsibilities. Your project management information system may also help you with this, and it can help you to integrate your risk activities, since activities will need to be added to your schedule, to your costs, and may also affect your resources as you identify certain resources that are needed in order to implement certain risk responses. And although meetings is not on the list, it's hard to imagine doing all of this without holding some meetings. Again, remember that these lists in the PMBOK guide of inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques, these lists are not meant to be exhaustive. Now to the outputs of implement risk responses. Remember that there are no new artifacts really that are generated as a result of this process, but there are many updates, including updates to your risk register and risk report to reflect any changes that happen during the course of the project. All sorts of changes can happen. Your risks and your evaluation of risks can change. Also, your risk owners might change, or the individual responses that you come up with may need some adjustment along the way. Any changes such as this need to be updated so that your risk register and risk report are kept up to date. Your project team assignments may change if you change the resources that are needed to implement specific risk responses. Your issue log, if you come across any issues or problems with risk response implementation, those issues should be recorded and updated in your issue log. Your lessons learned register should be updated with any of the challenges or successes that you have in implementing these responses. Information that can help you later on in the project as you're reviewing this lessons learned register. And any of these changes that need to change your baselines or other components of your project management plan, which have been baselined, will need to be made through change requests, which will go through your Perform Integrated Change Control process. Notice there's a difference here. Previous processes that we've covered have listed updates to the project management plan and have listed specific components of the plan. And then there's been some mention of the fact that these changes need to be done using a change request and go through the Perform Integrated Change Control process. However, this time, for implement risk responses, these updates are not listed separately, but instead they're mentioned under change requests. Personally, I think this is the better way to do it because it makes clear the need for a change request in order to change these documents. Either way, you should be aware this concept is represented differently in different processes in the PMBOK guide. So how much do you remember of the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of implement risk responses? Luckily, the lists are not very long. There are no new artifacts that are outputs. The only outputs are updates to your risk report and risk register and project team assignments, and also recording issues and lessons learned, plus of course change requests needed in order to make changes to baseline documents. Then as inputs, you have the primary inputs being your risk register and risk report, as that contains all of your information about your responses and lots of other details about your risks. And also your risk management plan for the rules on how to implement risk responses, and your lessons learned register and lessons learned repository. Then for tools and techniques, you have expert judgment, the influencing skill that you need to influence risk owners to make sure they're managing properly the risks that have been assigned to them, and your project management information system that can include tools to help you with changes that you need to make to your costs and schedule and so on in order to implement your risk responses. And now we come to the monitor risks process, which of course is part of the monitoring and controlling process group. Monitoring risks is about monitoring the implementation of the agreed upon risk response plans. In other words, monitoring your implement risk responses process. Tracking identified risks, identifying and analyzing new risks, and evaluating the effectiveness of your risk processes. As part of monitor risks, you'll need to keep an eye out and watch for times when you need to make changes to your risk management by watching out for the need for change in individual risks and new risks that come out, changes that may need to be made to your risk responses and to your overall project risk, keeping an eye on your contingency reserves for both your cost contingencies and your schedule contingencies to make sure that those are adequate, and checking to see if you need to change your assumptions or your risk approach, or perhaps even your project strategy. And what are the inputs that you need in order to monitor risks? Well, starting at the top, we have work performance data that comes from the direct and manage project work process, as well as work performance reports that come from the monitor and control project work process. The information from your work performance data and your work performance reports is used to compare to your risk register and risk report. The work performance data will include details about risk responses that have been implemented and risks that have actually occurred and risks that are still active and what their status is, as well as risks that no longer are an issue. Your work performance reports will include information about the performance of your project, information such as variance analysis and your earned value analysis and forecasting information that you can use to see where your project stands relative to risk. You can then compare this to the information you have about risks and your plans for risk responses in your risk register and your risk report. The issue log, of course, includes risk-related information about issues that have come up, and your lessons learned register, in which you've been recording information from previous iterations of monitoring risk in this process that can give you information about how best to monitor risks for the rest of the project, and naturally your risk management plan, because it has the rules and guidelines for how to monitor risks. Curiously, the PMBOK guide doesn't list any specific enterprise environmental factors or organizational process assets for the monitor risks process. But as you can imagine, there are all sorts of things in your environment that can influence your risks and how you monitor those risks. We have just a few tools and techniques for monitor risks, starting with some data analysis tools. The first being technical performance analysis, and this is where you compare your actuals to your planned targets when you're comparing your work performance data and work performance reports to your risk register and risk report and what you'd planned in your risk management plan. Also, you have reserve analysis, in which you're keeping an eye on your contingency reserves for risks. And you can do this with a burn down chart. Although burn down charts are typically used in agile projects to track progress of tasks being done, it can also be used for all sorts of other things, including tracking the usage of your reserves. The next main tool and technique is audits. This is simply an assessment of how well your risk management processes are performing. These should be held frequently. How frequently and how they're held and who should be there should be defined in your risk management plan. These will typically be held in meetings in which you hold risk reviews or audits. But it's important to make sure you keep these risk review meetings under control and that you stay on topic. These risk reviews can be either part of other meetings, in which case you'll want to make sure that you stick to the agenda and the time that you have, or they may be separate meetings in which you'll have the opposite problem of keeping people focused on risks during this risk review meeting. The main output of the monitor risks process is work performance information, which you'll recall is always about comparing actuals to plans or targets. In this case, comparing actual risks and risk management to the planned or expected risks and risk management. Change requests, of course, are another one, because they're necessary every time you need to make a change to anything that's been baselined, including the project management plan, which may need to be updated. And you have updates to other documents, especially the risk register and risk report, because you'll need to keep those updated so that they're always current with the latest information about all of these identified risks and their current status and their current response plans. And if any of this needs to be changed, you need to update these documents. And of course, record issues in your issues log, assumptions updated in your assumptions log, and updating your lessons learned register along the way. You may even find that the things that you learn about monitoring risks are so valuable that your organization decides to include them in its standard templates, including templates for your risk breakdown structure. To summarize your inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of the monitor risks process, your main output is work performance information. You may also have to issue some change requests to make updates to other documents, especially to your project management plans, but you'll definitely want to be updating your risk register and risk report with any updates to your risks. Inputs are primarily your work performance data and work performance reports, which you'll then compare to your risk register and risk report, and follow the rules in your risk management plan, plus any information in your issue log and lessons learned register. Tools and techniques is a relatively short list. You have some data analysis, including technical performance analysis, which is what you did in comparing your performance data and reports to your risk register and risk report. Reserve analysis to keep an eye on your contingency reserves for cost and schedule. Audits to see how well your risk management processes are performing. And meetings, especially risk review meetings. This lesson has covered the implement risk responses and monitor risks processes. It's especially important to remember that you do what you have planned in managing risks, that every risk has an owner, and that you add whatever tasks, scope, money, and resources are needed to implement these risk responses. And monitor risks is about reviewing your risks periodically and managing and checking on your risk management effectiveness frequently. For more information, you can consult with these pages of the PMBOK guide. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.